I'm delighted to pick up this next session, having heard from Andrew, Susan, and Keith. And what we've got now is a really fascinating panel of speakers who are able to share their own views on how some major city planners can outline their plans for moving towards carbon neutrality. And I think it's important that we've heard from a number of UK speakers and a couple of people who are critical to the future economy and the transition to net zero in Glasgow. I think it's important now we hear some views from Montreal, and who better to start than Philippe Couillard, who's the former Premier of Quebec and now a Senior Business Advisor with Dentons. Philippe, can you share your views, please?
Sure, thanks, Fraser. Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour tout le monde from Montreal, from Quebec. I must start my video here. Sorry, 1 second. So yes, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to start by giving you, the audience, a quick information on Quebec, the second largest province of Canada, the fourth producer in the world of hydroelectricity, which puts us obviously in a very favorable position as one considers energy transition. Close to 100% of Quebec's electricity is made of zero carbon sources, mostly hydro, but a bit of wind too. So that allowed Quebec to be active in energy transition. Noting, by the way, a few similarities with Scotland. We just heard a great talk from Glasgow. I would summarize it as having a strong identity, a very strong identity within a larger country, a larger political system. In our case, a federation. In the UK case, devolution of powers to certain regions. And I participated as Premier of Quebec in 2015 in COP21, which was, as you know, instrumental in the Paris Agreement. This conference also put in the front stage the subnational states and the cities that had a strong voice at that point and kept that strong voice since then. What we are seeing now is I would say, a large number of quote unquote net zero commitments coming from various corporations, governments, cities around the world. And we have to look very closely at this because there's some debate that is only starting, in my view, around that. Most of these net zero commitments are achieved through offsets, either through investing in forestry or funding some renewable industry, rather than directly reducing emissions. I think this is going to be more and more a subject of discussion. We hear the word greenwashing more and more as well when we talk about these issues. I think we have to face it as it is. Now, if we look at ways to reduce emissions, of course, each country, each economy has a different picture. In Quebec, as elsewhere, the building sector occupies a significant place in the emissions, but the transport sector represents in Quebec more than 40% of our emissions. Hence, the importance of public transit, urban sprawl, with all the political caveats surrounding this. Because of our hydroelectricity wealth, if I could call it that way, we have achieved significant electrification, and we are aiming for even more significant electrification of public transit in Quebec. I would give an example, which is also a way of introducing a discussion about funding of these initiatives. There's a large electric train project in Montreal called REM, R-E-M, like the rock group that some of you may know, older people, obviously, like me. This is a 63-kilometer electric train around Montreal, which also is an example of innovative financing. Because what are the challenges? The challenges are huge needs of public organizations and governments in terms of infrastructure, and a limit brought by public debt. Although people now say that this is not important anymore, my suspicion is, it will come back as an important discussion after the pandemic. And the other important aspect of that is the relative lack of private capital investment in public infrastructure. When I say this, I mean beyond P3 arrangements. So this train, which is called the REM, again, the Réseau Express Métropolitain, has been funded through an innovative partnership with the pension fund manager of Quebec, the Caisse de dépôt, which actually owns the project and controls it. And the government is a minority shareholder in the project, which allows the project to be off the balance sheet of the government, which is not a minor issue for governments around the world. But then the flip side of this is that a pension fund manager needs a return, expects a return, and also needs to exactly know where the value is going to come from. And the value is not going to come from, whatever people think, from fares asked users, but for real estate development around this type of infrastructure. I think it's an interesting model worth looking at. I know that many governments around the world have been attracted by this model of leveraging pension funds to fund green infrastructure. And I think this is something we will see more and more in the future. So I happily will participate in the discussion in the next minutes.
Philippe, thank you very much. Very helpful insight on Quebec and some of the innovation there. And I think if we build on that, I'd now like to introduce Patrick Aubin, the Senior Vice President, Cities and Development within EDPM Canada at SNC-Lavalin. Patrick, your own views, please.
Yes, so thank you, Fraser. Thank you, Premier Couillard. So thank you all for joining this great event. Good afternoon, bon matin. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. I have three main messages to convene today. So first one, there has never been a better time to accelerate the shift towards sustainable communities. So as the world slowly reopens, governments are pressed to act. More than ever, investment is up in areas such as transportation and social infrastructure. Why not build these new infrastructure projects using clean energy and integrate best-in-class standards with innovative solutions? Citizens are asking for sustainable solutions that will help reach a net zero future. Today, what we build and how we build it is different. Let's take the REM as an example. So fully electrical rail transit system. We've made like Premier Couillard was talking about, and we've made many design and construction of buildings such as, let's say, MUHC, Concordia University Genomics Center that got their LEED certification. So this is more important than ever. How assets are built needs to change. In our industry, we are playing a leading role in the digital transportation to digital twin technology and transforming the design with a focus on the design and construction interface. The industry needs to think about moving to a more circular economy of materials as the world's population continues to increase, and so too does the demand for natural resources. We must rethink how our societies transition to a more circular and sustainable economy where there a little to no waste. A great example of this circular economy is with aging infrastructure and the reuse of aggregates and raw materials such as steel. We must ensure that there are not just proceeds and disposed of after their use, but also to the production and usage can be more sustainable, both from new buildings and retrofitting buildings. My second message is, as a trusted partner, our goal is to turn sustainable ideas to reality. By meeting the specific needs of communities, our role is to help clients reach their net zero objectives as quickly as possible. In order to attain that net zero, so in Canada, the largest electricity increase in the country would be in the Ontario, while the smallest one being in Quebec, like Premier Couillard mentioned. Most of the electricity, if not all, comes from the renewable energy. In parallel with electrification, including commissioning electricity plant, there needs to be building energy efficiency measures to reduce peak loads on the grid during the winter. This can be coupled with new policy to encourage behind the meter electricity production and or storing. For example, by adding solar panels on rooftops or underground batteries. In any case, we will need innovation to ensure something not so novel novel in Europe, but that is new to Canada. Taking our company's 100 years of expertise to address the most complex challenges. So transition to 100% clean energy, such as hydro, nuclear, wind, solar, gas, countrywide planning of power grid, commitment to innovation. So Also, we need to think about net zero buildings and cities, making sure that we will decarbonize new and existing building campuses, estates, and cities. Net zero transportation, net zero strategic planning, net zero energy system, greenhouse gas removal, net zero industry infrastructure. Always thinking of new innovative ways to deliver projects by partnership with our client. This is probably one of the most important things. We strive to accomplish this through our pioneer engineering net zero plan. This strategy enables our clients to supply clean energy and help to protect their assets from the physical elements of climate change, as well as creative, innovative solutions that reduce the carbon intensity of transportation system, infrastructure, and entire cities. We create sustainable solutions that connect people, data, and technology to design, deliver, and operate the most complex project. And the last message, if not the least, so as a company, we have a responsibility towards our clients, our employee, and societies as a whole. Everything we do and everything we touch has a direct impact on the world around us. As an example, the REM project again, we believe it is important to lead by example, and this is why SNC-Lavalin recently presented our new zero carbon route map, aiming to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030. The intent is to use a series of targets to ensure accountability to our commitment and to measure our contribution to solving most of the world's pressing challenges. Our company purpose has been updated last May to reflect the way we see our role in society. So engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We strongly believe our commitment to the communities and clients we serve and demonstrate our engagement to grow in a sustainable and meaningful way. They also work hand in hand with our approach to sustainability and our overall environmental, social, and governance agenda, which is of the strategic importance to the organization. So thank you, Fraser. Thank you all.
Patrick, thank you. Some really interesting views there around innovation, technology, and the impact on broader society. If we move on, then I'm keen to hear from our next panelist, Martin Valente, who's the head of climate enterprise here in Scotland with Scottish Enterprise. Martin.
Thank you, Fraser. Hello, everyone. It's delightful to be with you today. I'm a proud Glaswegian. You'll hear a lot of that, I think, especially after November when we've saved the planet. But I'm a proud Glaswegian. But I live in a little town in Perthshire, which is twinned with a town, it's Carleton Place, so it's twinned with a little town in Ontario. So I do have a Canadian connection there. I haven't got a kind of like well thought through, fantastic, list of things to speak about. I just want to be dead straight and dead honest with you here. We are living in the most exciting time of our lives. We have the greatest single economic opportunity at our doorstep coming to Glasgow in 150 plus days time. And we need to be, I'll speak a lot about Scotland, but I'm speaking about the UK and an association, I'm speaking about the world, because what we do, we want people to be replicating and copying, and we want to be leading by example. So we, when the eyes of the world are in Glasgow, when the world turns up to see what the story is, because every COP has its own identity. Copenhagen sadly became Floppenhagen because there was a lot of expectation that wasn't lived up. I was there and I remember it. But I also remember at the time being in Copenhagen with this kind of Team Scotland, and we were trying to launch. In fact, we launched the world's highest climate change targets and the most industrialized climate change targets in the world. That was an interim target of 42% emission reduction from 1990 by 2020. Well, we smashed it. We absolutely went by that in 2016. So the point of that is that Even when you think you're being really ambitious, think again, because you're probably not. And even when you think you've covered all bases and you think you've got a really, really good plan, go and find someone else to partner with. The chances are you'll be able to augment that plan. You know, it's never a great idea to get myself and Keith Anderson on the same sort of event, because the two of us are so enthusiastic, and you know, and it might look stage managed when you get people as enthusiastic as us, but we realize, and I think you realize, and the world realize, is that when the world turns up to Glasgow, they're not going to see a nation on its knees crumbling under Climageddon. They're going to see a nation on its toes. This is a nation with ideas, with passion, with creativity, with solutions. We get some of the best academia in the world. We get research pools and innovation centres. But importantly, we get people who care. The people of Scotland are absolutely looking steely-eyed at Councillor Aitken, and they should be, you know, they should feel confident that Councillor Aitken and the team at Glasgow have got this. You know, that you literally couldn't find a better city who's going to be able to bring forward this vision of hope, because previous COPs have been very much about outrage and activism, and that's fine to a point, but there needs to be some hope. You know, hope mobilizes and fear paralyzes. We can't just sell fear. You know, and there's something I want to say, Fraser, about is like climate change is being sold for a long time. Yes, I'm very old, and I've been writing about this stuff and been involved in it for a long time. And the world is looking at someone else to solve the problem. It's always some other sector's problem. Well, if only government were braver. Well, if only businesses could do more. Well, if only investment would think about. Well, this is the no excuse era, because now we know we have investment lined up like never before, thanks to the likes of the work by UN Special Envoy Mark Carney, who announced only a month ago the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. And they're talking about trillions of pounds of US dollars looking for smart investments in the new economy. So let's make sure to get them. So let's make sure here in Scotland and in the UK and beyond, in Canada, we try and think more on we want to be a nation on its toes, not on its knees. So that there's something really important about the narrative. And so I never do presentations, I do propositions. I want to propose to you all is that this is history. These are the days of history, not just the 12 days in November. Now, we need to set ourselves up for success and not try to manage the problem. For a long time, we've viewed climate change as, and again, you know, the cliff edge scenario, and it drives me bonkers to hear that, because a cliff edge, who would jump off a cliff edge? Who would invest in someone jumping off a cliff edge? So let's agree today, a Scottish-Canada pact, I think we should do that, maybe raise a glass later, is that we're not going to speak about cliff edges anymore between now and COP. We're going to speak about something that's equally dangerous and equally perilous. So let's call it a mountain instead of a cliff edge. The reason why I want to do that is because we like climbing mountains. There's a spirit of adventure that people get when they're faced with the mountain. And actually, the bigger the mountain, the more excited you get. So there's something I think we need to adopt a whole new mindset and a new outlook. We cannot tackle the 21st century greatest challenge of our time with a 15th century mentality. We need to be far more Keith Anderson and Susan Aitken and Andrew. We need to be a bit more on our toes and thinking about, I'm going to plan for hope, I'm going to plan for success, and I'm going to be optimistic in every single thing I do. Why? Because the world needs us to. What they don't want is another combative climate change. And it isn't a surprise that the 25 that have come before 26, 24 of them haven't been terribly successful, because the prevailing conversations were about, what do we have to lose by not addressing climate change? And if you think about that, the subtext says, well, somebody's got to pay for something. And somebody's economic system is going to have to change. Otherwise, I'm not going to change mine. So you just end up with combat. Christiana Figueres, COP21 Paris, all changed. She came forward and said, well, let's talk about what we have to gain from tackling climate change. Let the other people over there worry about what they have to lose by not. Let's work with the fellowship of the willing and try and find out where that safe space for collaboration is on an international basis. She got there. What needs to happen next, and I'm picking up on the point that Keith made, is Paris was 9 out of 10. Glasgow needs to be 10 out of 10, because we have to take it to the next level, which is we get the 1.5 degree global understanding. Let's not scientifically argue about it for the next 30 years, because we don't have 30 years. Let's just agree that the future is net zero. That transition will be a just transition, so we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater like we did with the coal sector. Let's make sure we transition with the oil and gas sector and not transition them out. So let's be far more collaborative and less combative. And probably the last thing I would say is that, and again, I want to emphasize this, hope mobilizes, fear paralyzes. because the fearful Climageddon scenarios that are all you hear about now, is no wonder our children have climate anxiety. That's just not good. We can't allow and perpetuate this feeling of doom for young people, because believe it or not, they're the future, and they are going to be looking at us saying, what were you thinking? You know, and I agree with Greta Thunberg to the point where she says your house is on fire, but standing with a placard outside it saying down with this sort of thing isn't going to help. What we need to do, we need to change the activism to actionism. We need our young people now getting involved in finding solutions and driving forward, because that's more mindful, it's more spiritual, and it's far more enjoyable. So, Fraser, I could talk all day, as I'm sure you could see. I'm looking forward to getting into any of the questions that are appeared, which, by the way, look really good. But my last thing is that it's a plea from me, is just this person who's trying to align all of the different agencies in Scotland, so that when ideas come here that are going to solve global issues and create well-being and jobs, is that we don't, and this is my advice, is that you don't create this snakes and ladders, or chutes and ladders, I think it's called in the US and Canada, up one ladder, down a snake. Let's just create a board of ladders. Let's just say to businesses, when they want to invest in Scotland and the UK and in Canada, we've got ambitions for nature and for the environment and for our economy and well-being, and it's the same endeavour. Do you want to get involved? And let's make sure they've got pipeline of opportunities. So the world bankers don't buy concepts, they buy prospects. So I think what I'd love to see, if I could press a button, Fraser, is I would change the mindset from 50 years of arguing about climate change and finding out who to blame. Hasn't worked. The next 5 or 6 years has to be deep collaboration, and we have to make sure that countries like Scotland and the UK, who hit the jackpot twice on our geology, hit it the third time with their geography, with wind, with wave, with tidal and geothermal. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'll be quiet now and let some really sensible speakers come in next phase. Thank you for that.
Martin, thank you. And I think your passion and enthusiasm for the topic is visible to all. I'd like now to introduce our fourth and final panelist, Stefan Pacquiao, who's the president and CEO of Montreal International.
Thanks, Fraser. Thanks for the invite. It's always good to be back at the chamber. Good to be back in Glasgow also, although it's virtually. I promise the next time it's going to be in person, because we're going to be able to fly again and go to see our friends around the world. Maybe a quick word about Montreal International before I start. So basically, we do 3 things. We attract talent from abroad. In the greater Montreal area, we attract international organizations, and we attract foreign direct investment. So investment from abroad, also in the greater Montreal area, which is about half the size of Quebec in terms of population and GDP. And what I see now, and I will try to be as optimistic as Martin has been, but so what I see first regarding the international organizations, Montreal is considered, after Washington and New York, the 3rd biggest hub for international organizations in the Americas. So what we see there, we already have a cluster of international organizations who are active, be it in biodiversity, environmental changes, or other topics in that same family. And what we see is that, well, although some of them had difficulties in the last year, because some have, well, most of them have money coming from the governments, and so the last year may have been a bit difficult for some of them, but generally, what we see is a trend, and we see more and more of these international organizations setting up in Montreal in that specific cluster, because we think that's the place. And when you have UN-based biodiversity, like the Biodiversity Secretariat, it's always good to be close to them. So that's for the international organizations. Regarding FDI, and Premier Couillard talked a bit about it a bit earlier, but we do have the chance, and I see it honestly as a clear economic asset, to have 99% of our electricity that is renewable. And it's not only renewable, but it's cheap and it's reliable. So what we've seen in the last few years is either in Quebec as a whole, or in the Montreal, greater Montreal area, we've seen big players like AWS, Google, Microsoft, Vantage, or OVH from Europe, choosing the greater Montreal area or Quebec to set up very electricity intensive data centers. So it helps them to reduce their carbon footprint worldwide. So it's not just they come in Quebec and they plant trees, it's really they come in Quebec, and since the hydropower is renewable, it helps them to reduce their footprint. So we've seen that on the FDI. And maybe one last point before we go to the discussion is the whole thing about green finance. This is something where we've been active in the last few years, but where we see good momentum coming. Why? Well, because we already have an ecosystem that's active in that, but we see interest from many places around the world about this green finance. How can we do more on the financial sector, but also how can we calculate? You have the IFRS norms, but for the general accountability. But how do you calculate green finance? So that's something where we want to be more active on. We already have people studying that, but also the banks. Some banks headquartered in Montreal are active in that. Pension funds also. So that is something that we are working on, and I would be more than willing to talk more about it in the discussion. Fraser.
And thank you. So great to hear the views of our panelists just now. And in terms of sort of kicking off the discussion, I think something that we've heard a little bit. I mean, Keith talked there about removing coal power from the Scottish economy. We've talked about some greenwashing, and I saw that coming through some of the comments. What I think is quite interesting to explore is this move to net zero, is whether we're talking about genuinely removing carbon at source, or whether we're looking at complicated offset schemes and things like that. And Stefan, you mentioned the concept of planting trees. And perhaps, Philippe, I'll come to you first for your views, and then I might ask Patrick to add his own views on this question about what do we really mean by net zero?
Well, we should mean zero, but we're trying to put this in line with taking into account what we do on other sectors of the economy, and basically allowing ourselves to continue progressing in certain sectors that are producing emissions. I think that's what it's all about. So it's not only about reducing emissions. When you talk net zero, this is where you add offsets that you put against your emissions, hopefully taking you on the road of net zero emission. The problem is that, and there was, by the way, a very good paper this morning in Bloomberg Green on that. There's more and more scrutiny around this. People are wondering what it's all about, if it's real, if it's not just a financial gimmick, if I want to summarize it. So whatever the result of that debate is, we can expect much more scrutiny, much more regulation around that question of offsets in the coming years. But this being said, achieving direct emission reductions by acting on buildings, on transportation, is essentially something we can see as zero emission, going towards zero emission. That's what we should be doing.
Really helpful, Philippe. Thank you. And Patrick, do you have any views on that point?
So I already spoken, let's say, about this within my main messages. So one of the three messages. So about the circular economy, and also the reduction with the energy usage within buildings. So I think I'm pretty covered it within the messages.
Okay. Martin, Stefan, anything you would like to add before we move on to something else?
If I could, mine might be a bit left field, so I do apologise for people who will get a bit annoyed. But I'm a regulator by day, and I work for a regulatory agency. And like most regulatory agencies, we deal with businesses and we license them. And they operate to a term called BAT, best available technique. Now, quite a lot of the businesses are operating at the absolute best available technique. And are we really saying that we don't want them involved in working with biodiversity and nature? And the problem is that you look at a massive big whiskey firm who might be operating a BAT and have been excellent compliance for 15 years. They're still saying to me, Martin, I'm quite keen to get involved in doing stuff for the environment. But every time I try and do that, someone stands with a placard outside my building saying down with that sort of thing. And I think we need to be far more grown up. We're an educated species. We need to find a safe space for collaboration. I know for a fact, I'm sitting here in Scotland, we've got 600,000 hectares of peatland. And the public purse cannot afford to protect that peatland at the rate and the scale we want it to. So I'm keen to work with businesses who, you know, all the due diligence done, etc., are keen to get involved in providing some support for working with nature. It's a really important dilemma, and there's words that split crowds like Marmite, Brexit, and offsetting. But to be honest, there's so much safeguards now working with the nature agencies and the regulatory agencies and the TCFD. There's so many different mechanisms now. Whereas if you wanted to be a villain, you be a villain. But if you wanted to do good, we should try and encourage that. So I just wanted to throw that in as a kind of like side issue, because every day I deal with businesses, and I could list them all, but I probably shouldn't. And they are coming to me saying, look, we're operating at BAT, but I've got money. I want to get involved in working with nature. I want to get involved in protecting biodiversity. I'm really, really keen to help develop wetlands, but you know, it's a tricky space for us. How can we do that? So we need to be a bit more adult about conversing with businesses who really have motivation to try and help us achieve some of the things we want to achieve as a nation.
Yeah, maybe just a quick word, just to remind people that we don't start. All the countries, state and province don't start at the same place. So we all have to go to the closest we can to net zero. But the problem for Quebec, for example, is that we already have 99% of electricity that comes from renewable sources. So if you say, well, you need to cut 25% of your emission by that date, it means you can just shut down a coal plant and say, well, here's 10, there's 15 percentage points left to cut. It's way more complicated. You have to work on the people. Say, well, maybe do you need that big car? Can you have a smaller car? Do you always need to be one person in your car, or you can share the car to go to work? That's the type of thing, and that's where we are, and that's where it gets a bit more difficult.
Yeah. I think that is an important point, Stefan, that not everyone starts equal in this conversation.
Yep.
So in my day job, I work with some of the leading sort of financial services organizations. And one of the areas I'd like to look at now is this point around investment. So one of the earlier speakers made the point that there's a huge amount of investment required in infrastructure, technology, and financing the transition. And when I see this through the lens of the banks, the investment managers, some of the pension funds who are looking for long-term return on different projects. And I actually think one of the biggest challenges we've got here is putting in place the right funding, the right investment models, because this isn't something that's small change. This is a huge investment in infrastructure that has to last for generations. Stefan, I was interested you made the point about sort of foreign investment in the international hub of Montreal. Perhaps you'd like to share sort of some thoughts around about how we might deal with the investment challenges.
Well, that's let's say what I see in Montreal now is people from the banking community, from the pension fund community, who are very aware. You have people like a major co-op, it's called Desjardins in Quebec, who've been at the forefront of these discussions. And one of the things I hear more often from there is that we need to have rules, clear rules. And I know I won't go into details, but there are different rules now, but can we just make sure that we have one rule that everybody will use? And that it will be the same amount as you read your financial report at the end of the year. You look at the EBIT. You know the rules that have been used to go to get to the EBIT, the profit, the loss, the whatever it is at the end of the year. Can we have the same thing when we are talking about green finance? I have emitted 1 ton of GHG. Okay, what is it worth? How do you calculate it? And I did some efforts to counterbalance that. How much is it worth? So that type of thing. So that's the old discussion that's taking place in some circles in the financial district in Montreal with the pension funds, La Caisse namely, but also the National Bank, Desjardins, and other major players, major pension funds. So that's what they're looking for right now.
Yeah, really helpful, Stefan. Philippe, do you want to come in with your thoughts?
Yes, actually, it completes very well. What we're all saying goes in the same directions. If we want this to be believable and credible, it has to be, I'd say regulated, but it's a harsh word. I rather, as was just mentioned, say better defined. How do you know you're reducing emissions? How do you measure that? Who is the third party certifying that your calculation is the right one? First, it's going to be extremely important for publicly listed companies, obviously, in their reporting, but then also for governments participating in certain projects. And coming back to the very interesting peatland analogy that we heard a few moments ago, I think we have to be careful not to confuse corporations that are acting for nature conservancy or wetland protection. All this is very good, has some impact on greenhouse gas reduction, and action that are specifically directed at emissions. I think we have to be careful to put them in the right basket, if I can say so. And as far as financing, as was just mentioned, I think we see more and more interest in green bonds, for example, these type of partnerships with the pension funds. And the interesting thing about the Caisse de dépôt here in Quebec is that the deposit holders are public organizations related to government, like hospital employees or government employees in general, putting the pension fund there. So it's kind of a public partnership at the same time. So that's something also that we have to look at. But we're never shielded from contradiction. My own government, when I was premier, and I would do it again, we encourage a cement factory project in Gaspé Peninsula, relatively economically deprived area of Quebec. And I would do this again because the people there need to have hope in the near future in terms of jobs. But the solution would be to come in with this company and assist them in carbon reduction initiatives or carbon capture initiatives, for example, that could make this plant net zero or close much lower emissions than what they are now. Not telling people you must close that business. It's not going to be good and well received. Always remember that there's a certain limit to the people's elasticity in what they will accept to change in their own lives for the environmental cause. Here we're among people that are strong believers, so it's easier for us to say that. But if you take the parallel of the yellow jackets in France a few months ago, you could definitely see that there's a limit where the public just says, well, we don't want to pay more for that. So that we have to be cognizant of. And this is why making this project profitable and job creating is not only desirable, it is absolutely essential to keep this under, I would say, social license.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Martin, perhaps a thought from yourself in terms of the finance and the investment piece, given the role you play in Glasgow, in Scotland.
I'd put on the links there, Fraser, the GFAN's Mark Carney's now UN Special Envoy for Climate Finance, former Governor of the Bank of England, knows a thing or two about finance, and he set up the GFAN's, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, and he launched maybe a month ago. I was trying to find the link, but I couldn't do it. But if you Google it, you'll see it. And they brought together like 49% of the world's biggest investment bodies and groups together to look at mobilizing this kind of, because previous COPs had been, well, we could do this if we had the money. Mark Carney's job, and it's very clever they've done it, is they've said, well, I'll make sure that question isn't asked because we'll come armed with checkbooks, we'll come armed with money and finance and availability of finance. So in Scottish Enterprise, the organisation where I've got at the moment, we had a Race to Zero initiative with maybe about 2 or 3 months ago, and maybe a couple of thousand people on that. And the amount of businesses that were coming on saying, look, we've got investment, we just need ideas, we need the innovations, we need the interventions, we need the license. And that was the point mentioned by Philippe. So there's a point I think about, and I mentioned it glibly about the no excuse era. This literally is a no excuse era. We have everything we need to make this work for us. We just need to have the right attitude approaching it. And the attitude isn't, in my view, we are here just to fix a problem. We're here to explore the greatest economic opportunity over time. And we need to do that in collaboration. We need to do it in a just transition. And the point about the just transition is that we know in the world what an unjust transition looks like. We told the coal sector in the 70s, you're bad, you can leave. And they did. But when they did, they left massive economic decline and social economic deprivation and intergenerational unemployment and so on. So let's not do that again. This is why I think we need to be far more grown up and adult and mature and intelligent and liaise with those sectors who are presently stuck in some kind of transition pause and help expedite that by bringing some solutions, some ideas, some societal opportunities. Because if you just leave climate change for someone else to solve, I guarantee it, younger people than us at some point in the future will be here for COP30 saying, why didn't they do this in Glasgow when they had the finance, the money, the ideas, the innovation, the collaboration, Joe Biden, you've literally got everything in the same space now, and it's up to us, Fraser. This is back to that melodramatic statement at the beginning. This is the history writing era, and we are all part of it. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things about working in this space at the moment.
Martin, thank you. And I'm just going to say thank you to each of the panelists for your contribution just now, and try and draw to a close what we've heard so far. So we've heard some fascinating views from government, local city councillors, leaders of industry, and been able to pull together the views of Philippe, Patrick, Martin, and Stefan just now. Clearly, we're covering a really broad subject, but something that we are able to see quite clearly is the real challenge of our times. And what I think is really interesting in terms of what's come out of that conversation there alone is some of the nuances of the really personal issues in terms of people and society, and what this means for jobs, well-being, health, ways of living. But we've touched on some of the real practical challenges, and whether that's about where we drive our energy from. We've talked about the need to retrofit heating across commercial property, residential property. And if we think of the impact on everyone's homes and families, that's a huge impact trying to retrofit into property. We've talked about regulatory challenges, planning challenges. We've looked at transport needs. And if you think about the complexity of transport networks, both public and private, that have been in place for many, many years, often decades, we're now looking at the challenges of how we change those and evolve them for the future needs in a carbon neutral economy. And we have to do all this at a point in time where we're moving through, hopefully, towards the end of what is a global pandemic that's had a shock to our global economy that none of us have ever lived through before. How we emerge from that economy and build a green future that has a stronger economic growth that underpins the future economy that we all need to see. The investment challenges are significant, and it's fantastic to see some of our world-leading economies and the institutions and the governments that sit beside those looking at how we can finance the green recovery. But that money has to come to the fore now. That's not something we can wait for, because as we've seen, we need to make decisions today that will impact for future decades. I'm proud to sort of be based in Glasgow, live in Glasgow, and see the regeneration that our city has been through previously. What we're now looking at is the opportunity with COP later this year to plan the impact that we can have, not only for Glasgow, but for the rest of the world going forwards. And I hope that, and I've got 2 young children, I hope the future for them is kept within the global warming requirements that allow them to prosper in a safe global economy. I want to say thank you again for the panelists for your time just now, and I'll hand back to Alan.